You often find that these experiences, for instance, in the lives of the saints, may specifically be said to have occurred during meditation or during prayer, for example. So it's not a requirement, it's not necessary, but it does seem to be conducive. These apparitions, quote unquote, arguably manifest on a conduit of love. And that might sound corny, but the reality is that one of the most common kind of observations in psi research in general is that a strong bond between individuals is often kind of what these experiences are predicated upon. And that is, again, something that does come out in the tales. You do find this. You find that often the people do have a close bond. However, again, to clarify, it's not a necessity. It is absolutely kind of the majority of accounts, but it's not a necessity. For whatever reason, some people seem to have these experiences in relation to strangers, or they may simply have a greater capacity to kind of attain such types of information. Who knows? For instance, the chapter about auditory visions, the chapter about collective visions, and then when you kind of bring the cross-cultural and historical volume to bear within those categories, I think it's more helpful, because we already kind of understand those categories to exist regarding these experiences. But to go back to your question about volume in relation to time, like, for example, I couldn't tell you that in a particular period it occurs more than another. I can only tell you that it's been recorded more in certain periods than others. Like, for instance, it never have these types of experiences been recorded more often than they had in the late 19th century, for example, by parapsychological researchers. However, if you look in the lives of the saints, the work relating to the lives of the Irish saints, for example, there's a lot of these visions, and English saints as well. Some of these visions are invoked in order to kind of, they speak to the initial either conversion of a priest or of a non-monastic to the monastic path, for example. He speaks to the extent to which these visions may speak to the individual's connection to God, for example. So to be clear, although these visions have been, quote unquote, kind of used in that way, as many other types of experiences have been in these types of literature, it doesn't speak to whether or not they're real experiences. And clearly we know these are real experiences. So the shift, kind of sorting the wheat from the chaff in that regard, sorting out which are, quote unquote, real and which aren't, which are literary or literal, that's a job that I will leave up to other people, hopefully, who come later. For me, I was more interested in just presenting the data and seeing what comes of it and seeing what people do with it and seeing, do they find it interesting.
What about the maybe not religious, but at least what about the like spiritual aspect of the people that it's happening to? Like, because that to me is where
but yeah, it is interesting that in certain societies it's received entirely differently than others.
Is there any that just sort of, I mean, it sounds like that guy's sort of outlook was that it was normal. Is there any that like have a word for it, or is there any that sort of treat it with like just a normal, just happens?
Sure, like this comes across in many of the cross-cultural accounts. So yeah.
Because what about sort of the Buddhists and the Egyptians who like had their whole, like a lot of their focus was on the afterlife and the process of dying and I mean, absolutely. So I wonder how if it was, like just more popular, not more popular, but more, more substantial with either of those cultures, where they actually have names for the different, realms that you're traveling through after death.
But in ancient Egypt and places like even like in on the Sumerian tablets, for example, like you can extrapolate the extent to which these things are believed in kind of incidentally. And this is something that does come up. I mean, there's an Egyptian poem which was written by Pharaoh Senusroet, and it's an eulogy kind of to him, and it's related to his death in 1963 BC. Often you will just see that the individual has in the Hawaiian tales too, for example, that a king in a Hawaiian tale is visited by the ghost of his son, for example, and he already thinks to himself that might mean that his son is dead. It's when we're speaking to each other now. We don't have to keep defining the thing that's happening, but yeah, it is a very interesting question, and I hope that much more work is done on it. I hope that this book will hopefully inspire some people to do that.
It was just so it was a commonplace belief that they didn't need to make it a big synchronicity. Like we think of it as like, oh my God, this massive synchronicity. Now
Exactly.
that we've got that term, and it seemed because we live in such a skeptical thing, when something like this happens, we're just blown away by it. But to them, it was just normal.
Even in Midwest America, for example, many of the folklore journals there have accounts wherein the same thing occurs. The individual, upon sighting the ghost or what they think is a ghost, because often in these accounts, actually the apparition appears entirely lifelike. There's not a ghostly feature about it as such.
Graham Gainsford in the chat has a question. He's just across the channel from you in the UK. Do people have more visions when they are near rainbows?
I can't say that I know the answer to that question. I won't discount it as possible, considering the good luck associated with the end of the rainbow. But yes, I cannot answer that question. I apologize. We need to more firmly establish the extent to which this phenomenon is worldwide and ancient, and the similarities between the accounts, even with those two things said. But in terms of like mainstream academia's approaches to the concept of the crisis apparition, very little.
Well, I mean, I was going to save this for later, but we might as well do it now in the middle. I wouldn't mind hearing some of the more surprising or maybe chilling, or a couple of the stories that really stood out to you.
Off the top of my head there, first of all, there are actually many accounts from Canada. There are many accounts from Canada and among kind of native Canadians also.
Well, I am an Indian, so
interesting, because there are many accounts
carrying native
really?
Canadian, yeah.
And there are many accounts among the Modocs. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. The Salish and the Naskapi, for example, and the Copper Inuits, etc. There are many accounts there. But in terms of like really specific accounts, I like to consider the spread of accounts. Like we spoke about the Egyptian account, for example, from 1963 BCE. But you'll also find what's interesting is that you also find very typical crisis apparitions in the Greek legends and myths, and even relating to like the Trojan War. And like one of the classic examples would be the apparition. One of the most famous ghosts in Greek mythology is Creusa from the Aeneid, and that is the apparition of Creusa to her husband in the midst of the Trojan War. He was unaware that she had died at that time, and the death is later confirmed. What's interesting to me is that hasn't really been picked up by parapsychological research. Really, like a very typical account would come from the Irish Saint Columba, for example, who may be amidst his prayer or meditation, and he would see a vision. The vision may be like the death itself, or just the actual visual of a soul rising to heaven. Another interesting thing is that these messages are often specifically delivered by already deceased individuals. Her long dead brother walked into the room, looked at her very solemnly, kind of tipped his head, lifted his hat up, and just said the very simple words that, "Mary, it's Holly." What's interesting is that his account, in which his mother died in Chicago, and came to him as an apparition at the moment of her death, which he later confirmed the two things to have occurred at the same time. He said, I'm now convinced that the dead continue after, that the living continue after death based on this experience. So it's important for us to know that in our own times, these experiences can be both real and literary. They can be real, but also inspire literature. In other words, we shouldn't mix up the two and say that because they're literary, they're not real, because we already know that the opposite is true. And therefore, we can also speculate that maybe the same is true of that Egyptian poem, for example, that I referenced. So that gives us the kind of license to at least speculate in that regard.
Yeah, that's a good point. Does it have to be an apparition? Or because my girlfriend, for example, when her father passed away in the home, I think the lights flickered at that moment in the room.
Really?
Yeah.
So that is another aspect that I deal with in chapter 4, I believe, which deals with the so-called life tokens. So like the idea that I'm sure you guys have heard of this concept also, that the idea that at the moment a loved one dies at a distance, something in the house may occur, a picture frame may fall, for instance, or something electrical may occur, for example, and often the object that is impacted may be a watch or an alarm clock. Often the object itself actually has a specific connection to the individual who had died. which is interesting in and of itself. But what's interesting about that, and as I go into in the book, in what is, I think, maybe the most boring chapter, but I find it interesting, is the chapter on the life token, where the same thing is true in the legend, lyric, and lore of the title. The individual in the hero leaving on a journey, for instance, the prince may offer a ring to the princess or to his wife, etc., and say, if this ring changes color, for example, that's when you know I've died. Or an aboriginal, a tribesman may plant a stick in the ground, for example, and say, if this stick falls over, you will know that I'm dead. Or, for instance, somebody from the far north, maybe living in Nunavut, for example, will a certain type of shoe, for example, they will have hanging from the mantle. If these fall from the mantle, you will know that something has happened to me, for example. It is quite astonishing how widespread those very specific stories are. And in my opinion, they relate the experiences that we still have, those experiences such as we referenced with the picture frames falling, the clocks, etc. I think those are the modern version of those experiences.
In some ways, this is making me think that that it's proof that that the dead are sending proof that they know they're dead. And they're not stuck in some limbo, because I know that there's the modern day, school of literal school, the Monroe Institute, with their soul rescue programs, where they teach people to go out and rescue souls that are trapped in this limbo. And then there's the ancient, Egyptians and the Buddhists and stuff that know, or the Tibetans that knew that you go through these other phases during death. And I think there was a focus because of people getting trapped there, right? I mean, that would be hellish if you realize that you're trapped in this bardo or this limbo. But if people are making these, they're reaching out through these crisis apparitions, that would be one way to just relieve your loved ones of you being trapped.
Absolutely. It would be a way to kind of, well, actually, that's an interesting point, because in some of the accounts from like the Middle Ages, or sorry, in the kind of early modern period, you will see some crisis apparitions specifically in relation to, what you just said, like these kind of purgatorial visions of souls, where the individual is told, oh, actually, because of this experience, I know they're not in purgatory, for example. And it's interesting to see that sentiment come through, because it's the same today. The individual is, and this is made very clear in the book and in many of the accounts in the book, that the individual is now assured that, like, it's very rare that there will be now, it's not impossible, but it's very rare that there is a real sense of doubt regarding the nature of this experience. It's often very clear to the individual that what I think happened is what happened. This really was the individual that I loved sending me a message, and now I really believe that they're okay. So you can only imagine the kind of reassuring component to that, which is very fascinating. Yes.
Yeah, like they've been through Hades, they're resurrected, and maybe not into physical life, but they've gone through whatever they need to go through, and they're moving on or something.
Although the initial definition of a crisis apparition was 12 hours before or after
the death. I was going to ask about that time scale.
Yes, it's very interesting and important, because while it's helpful for categorization and even approaching the topic at all, it is ultimately arbitrary. And no matter how much time has passed after the death, if you discover the death by the means of an apparition or one of these experiences, it is still the same thing. That's why I opened the conversation with saying that what my interest is general intimations of a death by non-ordinary means. If you want to make a case that the afterlife is real and consciousness can survive bodily death, it's usually obviously not helpful to just use one line of evidence. However, if you could only choose one line of evidence, I would say that, in agreement with those people, that this would be one of the strongest lines of evidence, because if you apply Occam's razor to these accounts, it does require the least number of explanations and postulations. It's entirely reasonable that in coming to terms with many hundreds and honestly even thousands of these accounts, that it is very powerful anecdotal data for the survival of consciousness.
It's only since recently, since the darkening or the supposed enlightenment, that we've stopped believing in this.
Exactly. And it's interesting because, like, while many people consider the crisis apparition to be powerful evidence for the survival of consciousness, and this is probably especially the case during the near-death experience, because the individual is seemingly clinically dead when this experience occurred, And even if they were obviously just very compromised, it's still challenging to explain. But my point is that a book that I'm working on at the moment deals with the fact that the kind of setup for the book is, if the crisis apparition has been considered powerful evidence for survival of consciousness, it's actually evidence that's been understated. I believe it's actually more potentially, it has the potential to speak more strongly to that possibility than has been already said. And it's for very specific reasons that I will be going into in the new book. And that is, and I'll just give an example for one example. Okay. So as we kind of mentioned at the beginning, the fundamental mystery is the coincidence between the event and the timing of the distant event. They act and appear in a manner that's contextually related to their actual predicament. So not only are they a quote unquote ghost that you didn't know were dead. So even at the time, they're actually acting dead in very specific and idiosyncratic ways. It's actually quite common, for example, during a near-death experience, that the deceased relatives met with appear younger, for example, often decades younger, generally described as in their prime. Now, they also communicate, for example, non-verbally. That's something that comes across commonly too. I had multiple chapters that I couldn't include in this book. Thankfully, one and a bit of those chapters will make their way into the second book, which comes out in July. It's called Telepathic Tales. And that book takes the formula of this book, the cross-cultural and historical formula, but it applies it to many different types of extrasensory phenomenon, but specific focus on ones that have been underrepresented in the literature, or nearing death awareness, which is the very fascinating but real and medically well-established phenomenon of the individual becoming aware, not that they would die soon, but the specific time that they would die, often to the day, and then that later actually coming to pass. And that's in the context, by the way, of something that is very well known and has been published in the Lancet in studies. For example, it's very challenging even now for physicians to be specific about the day of death, the week of death, let alone the day. So this phenomenon is challenging, and I deal with many phenomena like that in that new book. But just to be specific to your question, there isn't much about what I just mentioned regarding those idiosyncratic aspects of the apparition in the second book.